Afternoon, everyone. Welcome aboard the Rainbow Warrior. It's a pleasure to have you all here. Can you hear me up the back? Okay, wonderful. The wind is our friend today. Sending our deepest welcome to you all. And before we kick off, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we meet here on and the traditional waters, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and in particular pay respects to any First Nations people joining us today, either on the ship or online. We had a beautiful welcome to country by Uncle Henry this morning, and really reminded us of why we're here and why we're about to commence this tour, the Rainbow Warrior through the Pacific Islands as part of our Pacific Climate Justice Tour. So without further ado, I am going to do a little bit of housekeeping and just let people know that the bathrooms are just through past the left there into the west. There's one bathroom, so do be careful when you're walking around the boat. It's pretty steady today, but yeah, there's one bathroom down there. Today's event will go for about an hour, and we'll have an opportunity towards the end for questions. So please do hold on to those questions, and you'll have an opportunity to ask those a little bit later on. I'd also really like to acknowledge the leadership people sitting on both ends of this table, in particular Uncle Paul and Uncle Pabai, who have been leading this incredibly important climate case, Australian climate case, and showing immense leadership through their work. So it's an honour to be sharing the stage with you both. And I will, before we begin, say a huge thanks to the crew on board the Rainbow Warrior who have helped set up and brought us all together today. All right, so I'm going to introduce our panelists, and first I'm going to introduce Uncle Pabai. Uncle Pabai is a Gudam Malagul man and a traditional owner on the island of Boigu. He has 5 daughters and 2 sons. Uncle Pabai has lived on Boigu his whole life and is a director of the prescribed body corporate that represents the 6 clans on the island. Uncle Pabai, Boigu is extremely low-lying. The highest point is 3 meters above sea level, making it very vulnerable to flooding. The flooding is getting worse because of climate change. As a Boigu man, he has specific responsibility to protect sacred cultural sites, but the rising sea is making it impossible and could mean they disappear forever. Loss of these places would be devastating for communities now and for generations to come. That's why he's bringing this case, his cultural responsibility to protect community, culture and spirituality from climate change. Welcome. And then on the other end, we've got Uncle Paul Pabai. Uncle Paul is a Gudam Malagul man and a traditional owner of the islands of Pabai. He's a director of the prescribed body corporate, which represents the 7 clans on the island, who has 2 daughters and 6 sons. Uncle Paul's family has lived on Pabai Island for more than 65,000 years. Uncle Paul says if we become climate refugees, we will lose everything: our homes, community, culture, stories and identity. We can keep our stories and tell our stories, but we won't be connected to country because country will disappear. That's why he's taking the government to court, because he wants to protect his community and all Australians before it's too late. But on my left, we've got Anjali Sharma, 19 years old, and was the lead litigant of Sharma versus the Environment Minister, a class action which in 2021 successfully established that the Environment Minister owes a duty of care to all young people and to protect them from the impacts of climate change. Anjali aims to raise awareness about the disproportionate impacts of climate change, particularly towards young people and people of colour, and advocates for a just future where the voices and stories of marginalised communities are amplified. Ange is also an assistant campaigner at Greenpeace Australia Pacific and will be setting sail across to Vanuatu with the uncles on Monday. Isabel Ranecki, the founder and executive director of the GRATA Fund. In 2017, Isabel founded the GRATA Fund, a leading not-for-profit at the University of New South Wales that acts as a campaigner, litigation incubator and funder for people and communities challenging the systemic gridlocks between 3 areas: human rights, climate injustice and democratic freedoms. GRATA has incubated numerous landmark cases that have set significant precedents and shifted the dial on important subjects, from challenging climate law and justice, climate change and justice, to exposing abuse in offshore refugee detention centres and establishing new rights to humane housing in remote First Nations communities. Pleasure to have you here, Isabel. And my colleague Katrina Bullock is on my right, an award-winning lawyer at the General Counsel of Greenpeace Australia Pacific. Katrina has been working with Greenpeace's Pacific Climate Justice team over the last few years to help secure a strong advisory opinion on human rights and climate change from the International Court of Justice. And my name is Steph Hodgins-May, and I'm the project lead for Greenpeace Australia Pacific. And now that we know who's with us, I'm going to start with a few questions myself, but please, as I suggested, if you're watching in online or if you're here today, do keep your questions and feel free to share them in the chat if you're watching it online, and we'll seek to answer those throughout as well. So Uncle Paul and Uncle Pabai, you've just finished up the first part of on-country hearings for your climate case. And we definitely want to know all about what's happened there. But first, can you tell us about your island homes on Boigu and Pabai and what climate impacts you're seeing there now? Yeah, can you share with the audience what you're seeing now?
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, my name is Uncle Pabai. I'm the Guatemala Nation, which is located at the northern part of Australia, where the Torres Strait are. And Guatemala Nation is a three-top Western island, Salvador and Boigu, and my island is, I'm from Boigu Island. It's about 5 kilometers off the international border of PNG, Papua New Guinea, and it's a lying island surrounded by mangroves and mud, and also sand. The important impact that this is why people think that about this case. This is very important to my people, and we started this case back in 2021. I replaced the GRATA fund to get us through this case, and the journey that we've gone through, trying what is the best for our own communities. How can we stop the impact of the climate change? We must acknowledge the traditional owners, the ancestors of our communities. This is how the acknowledgement has been handed down from generation to generation. And I believe that, and I witnessed that because we are the people of the culture. The culture is based on our first priority of our protocols system. About my community, my island Boigu, as I said, that it's low-lying islands, and it's rapidly impacted by climate change. And the journey that I took on board, and I'm challenging the government for the duty of care. And what is important to me that I must state that to working my people and to working my younger generation, we want a livelihood. And when we're looking at today, my island is really well sinking. I can say this because I know, I believe, and I see that. And a week ago, a couple of weeks ago, I took the federal court to my community and to get the truth evidence to the judge, and I take the court to the island, and I took the judge around the tour of the island to see what the impact that has been happening from before time I was born, and until today, the impact rapidly damaging the communities and flooding the houses and the gardens all destroyed by the salt water. And today we're looking at we don't have those sort of things anymore. So it's very hard for people to move on, traditional livelihood, because that's giving us the opportunity to knock on the government door to say that what's happening to my community and what happening to my people.
Thank you so much. And I might, because of the wind, just ask panelists to keep the microphone a little distance from your mouth because it's picking up. No, I was doing the same thing. Well, we are about to set sail across the Pacific Islands. Uncle Paul, would you like to add any comments about the climate impacts in the Pacific?
Yes, good afternoon. Before I start off, I'd just like to acknowledge traditional owners of this land where we're floating at the moment. I just like to acknowledge the elders past, present. Before I get into more further, I just start, because Uncle Pabai covers everything. So Pabai and Boigu are both low-lying islands. They both made out of sediment that flows out from Fly River in Papua New Guinea. As my colleague was saying, that erosion is the most impact on our islands. So that's why we are in front of leading the case, making our voice to the government. Just recently, early this year, we had a visit from former president of Kiribati, Northern Tong, and he was visiting Pabai and Boigu, and the message that it was given to us was like, we are in very same situation like there in Pacific. And the photos we've showed him about what we have been going through all these years, and we end up being like, as a neighboring brothers and sisters, we all fighting through the same process, and we all heading in that same direction. So I think this journey of us through Pacific will have a message passed properly to our neighbors in Pacific, like what we in Torres Strait been going through all these years, and so we can have a better voice to the government about the climate change and how to stop the gas emission.
Thank you, Uncle Paul. So in 3 days' time, Uncle Paul, Uncle Pabai, and Anjali will set sail from Cairns through to Port Vila in Vanuatu. And I'm really keen to hear from you, Ange, as a young person, as a climate leader yourself, what is the importance of this trip, and what sort of action should we expect to see from the Australian government if they want to be true to their word and their promise to be part of the Pacific family?
So this trip is built around the International Court of Justice campaign, which is a proposal voted on at the UN, championed by the country of Vanuatu, and will now take the issue of climate change to the highest court in the world, the International Court of Justice, to render an advisory opinion which could strengthen the legal framework for climate cases like Uncle Paul and Uncle Pabai's across the world and for years to come. So the significance of this trip is that what we're trying to do is get the Australian government to put forward a strong and ambitious submission to the court that asks the court to really hand down an advisory opinion that will ensure that rulings like Uncle Paul and Uncle Pabai's, and like many climate cases in the future, are in line with the climate science and compel greater climate ambition instead of allowing fossil fuel polluters and big corporates to get away with the climate wrecking operations that they are today and that we're seeing right now. Currently, it's sad to say, but a lot of the times it feels like the Australian government is all talk and no action, because they're using Pacific people almost as a prop to bid to host COP31, the great UN conference of parties in Australia with the Pacific, while still being the third largest fossil fuel exporter in the world, while still greenlighting more coal and gas projects and granting more fossil fuel subsidies, while the Pacific is calling for the actual opposite. So the purpose of this trip is to hear from people who are really leading the charge, really leading that climate opposition, to bring their stories to the Australian government and to compel the strongest submission to the International Court of Justice, so that Uncle Paul and Uncle Pabai's case and the many to come in the future can compel greater climate action.
Thank you, Ange. And I suppose I'm keen to hear from you, Isabel, on really the legal theory behind Uncle Paul and Uncle Pabai's case, and yeah, why you're in Cairns now, essentially.
Thank you. And I'd like to acknowledge the Guatemala traditional owners and elders who are here in the audience today. Thank you so much for joining us. This case is based off the world first global climate landmark case, which happened in the Netherlands. It first won in 2015 and then won again on appeal. And that case was brought in the Netherlands by a whole bunch of Dutch people, arguing that the government there had a duty of care to protect Torres Strait, that's here, to protect Dutch people from, am I holding that okay for the wind? To protect Dutch people from the catastrophic harms of climate action. And at the time in the Netherlands, it sort of seems a bit strange to think in a way, but at the time in the Netherlands, it was quite a similar policy approach to climate action as what we see in Australia. So despite the Netherlands seeming to be this sort of place of, you know, utopic social policy, it actually was pretty terrible in terms of its climate policies. And that case changed everything in the Netherlands and put the Netherlands on a real leader in climate action. So Uncle Pabai and Uncle Paul's case is to use the same theory, just to say to the Australian government, you have a duty of care in Australia to protect Torres Strait Islander people, their land, seas and culture from climate harm, and you're failing to do that. And then the final piece of that is for the court to order an injunction to say to the Australian government, you must act in accordance with the best available science, which means a emissions reduction target of net zero by about 2035, not net zero by 2050, which is apparently what we're on. Well, apparently we're on track for, but I mean, it's completely basically useless for us all. So Uncle Pabai, Uncle Paul have really bravely taken this case on for their communities in the Torres Strait, but it really has benefits for all of Australia and all of the world, because the impact won't just be felt in the Torres Strait, where people are really on the front lines of the impacts of climate change. It'll actually matter for us all in terms of the Australian government's approach to climate action. I'm very grateful to these two leaders for taking this cause on.
Yeah, thank you so much. And from Greenpeace Australia Pacific side, we've, as Anjali mentioned, this Pacific Climate Justice Ship Tour is about the International Court of Advisory opinion that has been really pushed from Pacific activists, in particular young people right across the Pacific. And Kat, I know the Rainbow Warrior, as it travels from Australia to Vanuatu to Tuvalu and Fiji, will be gathering evidence as part of this submission process. Can you tell us a little bit more about the ICJAO and what it means for climate litigation globally?
Absolutely. Thanks, Steph. I mean, this is a campaign that began in a legal classroom in the Pacific by 26 students, and it has grown and it has sailed around the world, gaining momentum, and is now a global movement that we're so fortunate, Greenpeace, to be a part of. We've been working on it for many years with mobilizations and petitions and support for the students and the broader alliance to get it to where it is today. And I think one of the things that's quite amazing about a strong advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice is that it has the power to reinterpret international law in a way we've just never seen before. So if you look at international law at the moment, it's very inadequate when it comes to climate change. We've got all these terrific international agreements and treaties like the Convention on the Rights of the Child that say, hey, we need to protect the rights of the child. We've got the Convention on the Law of the Sea that say, yep, absolutely, we must protect our oceans and our seas. But because a lot of these agreements and treaties were signed on by governments at a time where there wasn't a high level of consensus on the climate science, an understanding of the scale and impact of the climate crisis, almost all of these treaties are silent on how to protect the rights of the child when it comes to climate change, how to actually protect the oceans when it comes to climate change, and what the exact obligations of governments are in relation to those already existing international conventions, agreements, and treaties. So this is all about getting the world's highest court, the International Court of Justice, to reinterpret the entire body of climate international law in light of the most recent climate science. And we're hoping to see a very powerful judgment from the International Court of Justice that will really cement the consensus on climate change. because I've just come from the Netherlands. I flew in at about 1 a.m. last night. Big thank you to everyone on board the boat that's been plying me with caffeine all morning. And I was over there with a bunch of my colleagues who'd gone to the climate conference in Bonn. And as they enter those rooms, negotiating with different countries and supporting Pacific and other impacted communities in those spaces, what they're finding is that the climate science is still not accepted in many parts of the world and in many cases and courts around the world. So when you get a judgment from the highest court in the world acknowledging the climate science, that's powerful. That's something that courts around the world and legislative bodies around the world pick up. It's a new baseline. So we're expecting a judgment really stating what the obligations of states should be. We're expecting a judgment that will say, hey, in order to protect the human rights of current and future generations and also of vulnerable or climate vulnerable communities around the world, every country needs to be doing their part to keep global warming at least below 1.5 degrees. Because at its core, yes, there's biodiversity and there's climate impacts from the climate crisis, but at its core, the climate crisis is also a human rights crisis. For every part of a degree of global warming, what we're seeing is the denial of human rights to millions of people around the world. Denial of the right to life, the right to food security, to clean, safe, healthy drinking water, to culture, to the ability to pass your lands on to your children and your grandchildren. So we're really hoping to see basically the climate science cemented in the world's highest court. We believe that this campaign and a court judgment is going to result in increased ambition under international agreements. So as we're walking into those negotiation spaces, we really want it to breathe new life into those multinational negotiations so that every country knows what the minimum obligation they must do is in order to protect human rights, and that they're complying with that when they're going in and they're setting new agreements about how they're going to tackle the climate crisis. And of course, last but not least, we're here launching a journey through the Pacific where we'll be highlighting cases around the world. And the reason for that is we expect the International Court of Justice advisory opinion to bolster climate cases in every jurisdiction. When you've got the highest court in the world saying, okay, these are the exact legal obligations that governments must fulfill to protect current and future generations and their human rights in the face of the climate crisis, and you've got a judgment that says, okay, these are the legal consequences for breaching those obligations and causing significant harm to the environment, that has a big impact because courts use that as persuasive precedent. It will basically determine how they will be able to interpret international treaties and government obligations when cases come before domestic courts. So there's already an incredible amount of work being done by brilliant lawyers and organizations like GRATA Fund, by terrific, bold, strong community leaders like Uncle Paul and Uncle Pabai, and of course work against the Australian government by Sharma and Equity Generation lawyers and others. Throughout this tour, we want to highlight some of those cases around the world because what we are seeing is this people-powered symphony of climate cases being brought into tandem in different jurisdictions that are seeking to hold governments and big polluters to account. And that's really, really exciting. And a powerful, expansive ICJ advisory opinion can have a massive impact on that. So throughout this tour, as we sail through the Pacific Islands and we collect evidence for the International Court of Justice, we'll also be highlighting many of these cases. Today, of course, I had the opportunity to hear about the brilliant Australian climate case. We'll also be highlighting Klimasinnerinen, another case that Greenpeace has been fortunate to support in Switzerland, where over 2,000 women are taking the Switzerland government to court for not doing their part on climate change. We'll be highlighting another Greenpeace-supported case in Bonaire, a Caribbean island owned by the Dutch government that seeks to hold the Dutch government responsible for not doing their fair share to tackle climate change. I'll stop now because I could go on all day, but thanks for the question, Steph.
Thank you. Who thinks Kat's excited about this tour taking off? I think for the Rainbow Warrior and Greenpeace's work, a really important part of it is bearing witness to what is happening and these deep climate impacts. So I'm really keen to hear from Uncle Paul and Uncle Pabai about the importance of the court coming on country to do their hearings and to gather evidence and what that meant for the communities in the Torres Strait.
Yeah, I think that's a powerful statement that we brought forward, and I can say this that we are fully supported by our community, and we are fully supported by our elders. And well, I believe that the evidence that from the three, well, from Pabai, Badu, and Boigu, that so far that we are in the powerful statement that we deliver to the court. We hear that the evidence that we brought forward to the court, and we really focusing on those evidence, and the evidence are stated the truth evidence that we deliver, and well, we still have more time, and we got the last hearing will be on November, and we'll see what happens after that, and for probably next year as well. Yeah, thank you.
You want to add to that, Uncle Paul?
Yeah, like Pabai was saying, like, the elders, not only on Badu, Boigu, and Saibai, supported us. It's all around Australia. People from Saibai, Boigu are now living right around Australia, and not only them, because we've been on GRATA for 3 years, and we've been on media for so many years, and we have been supported that far. And here we now selling, ready to get sale overseas. And so we really need support from out there, not only us, from wider indigenous, non-indigenous people. So that'll encourage us, not only me and our colleague here, that'll keep us strong to take this message across to the government.
Yeah, thank you both so much. And Isabel, I suppose as someone who's been involved with that case from the beginning, what are your reflections of how the hearings went?
So for those who don't know, there was recently hearings of the federal court on the islands of Saibai, Boigu, and Badu. So that literally meant the government, their lawyers, Uncle Pabai, Uncle Paul's lawyers, and a judge of the federal court, Justice Wigney, travelling out to the island. Court was pretty casual compared to what it normally is. People weren't in their wigs, they were in shorts and t-shirts. It's quite fun seeing a federal court judge sitting out there in his t-shirt and thongs. And community halls were decked out in beautiful local decorations by the communities and turned into courtrooms, which is a pretty special experience. Even one of the lawyers for the government who'd done a lot of native title work around Australia, in mainland Australia in the Torres Strait, said that it was the most beautiful decorations of a community hall come court that she'd ever seen. So that was pretty special. However, that didn't convince her that she should drop the case and just give in to everything that we're saying, unfortunately. So the purpose of getting the court there to hear from Uncle Pabai, Uncle Paul on their own country and to hear from their community members is to explain to the court the significance of what we're talking about. It's sort of can be easy to compartmentalize some of these climate harms. We do hear about them a little bit. It is what motivates us all, but really seeing face to face where a beach used to be a productive piece of land and has been completely inundated by mangroves, huge beach almond trees that have fallen over and are now dead, massive inundation of mangroves, fertile lands which were used for generations to grow, trade and eat. Hundreds of tons of watermelons and taro and cassava, which are now saltwater and we hold any crop. It's a different thing to actually see it on country and spend time with people and see at an emotional level. And whenever we talked about it, we kind of said, look, this is about talking to the judge's heart, talking from your heart to the judge's heart, because it's a big ask what the court's being asked to do. It's pretty transformative. I mean, this is a seriously game-changing court case. If it wins, it does permanently shift the Australian government's approach to climate change on a wholesale, all of government level. It is absolutely massive. So to get the court to be in a position to say, yeah, actually, I'm willing to go that far and give that injunction, we really need the court and the judge to be pretty deeply invested and really see in his heart and in his soul the impacts that we're talking about. And I think from that perspective, the uncles can say from their perspective, but I think, it was mission accomplished. We know that the judge was extremely moved. He was presented by Uncle Laurie Nona in Bardu Island, which is a very kind of typical tropical island that you might picture in your imagination, bright blue waters, beautiful white sands. Uncle Laurie presented the judge with an artwork. Now, he's a very well-respected artist himself. You should look up Uncle Laurie Nona if you're interested in Torres Strait artworks. And when he presented that artwork to the judge, he said, "I'm so moved that I'm speechless," and he was pretty much in tears. So from the perspective of really speaking to his heart, I think the community did an absolutely stunning job. And the next step here is for the court to hear the evidence from scientific experts, which I can't talk about yet because it's the government doesn't have the information yet, so we don't want them to know too much in advance. But those hearings will take place partly up here again in Cairns, so more community can come along, and then in Melbourne as well. And then hopefully by the beginning of next year, we have an outcome. But I think one of the things that I really learned through this work, I think, you might hear, oh, Boigu or Pabai, you can see Papua New Guinea from those islands. And, here, oh, it's 5 kilometers from Papua New Guinea. But the Torres Strait is really part of Australia, culturally, spiritually, and legally. There's a thing called the Torres Strait Treaty. The Torres Strait Treaty was signed by the Australian government with Papua New Guinea in the 70s and came into force in the 80s. And that literally says that the Australian government agrees that they have a legal obligation to protect the Torres Strait and its land, seas, people, culture. And that's it's off that treaty which the duty is based. So I think it's really important for us to remember, yes, the Torres Strait is far from here, it's remote, but it's very much part of Australia. It's a strong history of leadership. Think of Eddie Mabo, his leadership for the entire country that comes out of the Torres Strait, the biosecurity care that people in the Torres Strait take care of for all of Australia. There people are literally on the front line of the border protecting our cattle industry, massive agricultural industry, due to the biosecurity practices that take place up there. The final thing I'd just like to share is that Gudamalagal, which is the nation that Uncle Pabai and Uncle Paul are from, Guda literally means the gap or the mouth. And if you're standing at Pabai or Boigu and you're looking north to Papua New Guinea, you see the mouth, you see the gap of the strait. And what it means is the mouth of the gap, the opening for the spirits to come for all of Australia. And I think that is a really beautiful visual and spiritual message of the leadership of the Torres Strait. And I think we can be very grateful to these men for what they're doing.
Thank you, Isabel. And as a young person yourself, and as someone who's got family in India, also on the front lines of the climate crisis, how does it make you feel, seeing what our allies in the Pacific are doing, these young people driving forward this global climate case? How does it feel to see the uncles pressuring the government to step up and take action? And I suppose this growing tide of climate litigation where people are taking the law into their own hands because of the failure of governments. How does that make you feel as a young person?
There's two answers to this. One is obviously hopeful. It's great to see communities taking back their power and really leading the charge through the courts. But the other one is angry because, like Steph said, the reason that Uncle Paul and Uncle Pabai are spending their time in court is probably not because they want to assume this massive financial burden and they want to, spend hours painstakingly finding evidence and presenting it to the Federal Court of Australia. It's because the governments have continuously failed people in their inaction and in their delay and denial of climate change. That's why we're at the point that we're at. That's why Uncle Paul and Uncle Pabai are having to tell the court, not just tell, but show the court what rising sea levels and coastal erosion are actually doing to the human rights of people on Boigu and Pabai. That's why someone like me and 7 of my friends, who were all under the age of 18, spent 2 years of our lives taking the Federal Environment Minister to the Federal Court of Australia, assuming a massive financial burden, finding lawyers, drafting affidavits when we could have been in school and living the lives that teenagers do. It's really maddening that some of us have to assume this burden because our governments continue to greenlight fossil fuel projects and have fossil fuel donors in their pockets. But again, it does make me feel hopeful because it shows that people like us, we won't back down, we won't let the government run rampant with fossil fuel donors in their pockets and, you know, continue to capitulate to the demands of Woodside and Rio Tinto and Santos, because there is groundswell community opposition against it. And then there are organizations like Greenpeace and GRATA Fund that are bolstering and amplifying that support. And when I see groups of people like this, and when I watch the news and I see activists taking back their power through the courts, through other avenues of change, and I see large communities of people speaking out against climate wrecking operations, I think that if we have this many people on our side, then we're definitely going to get to a point where we do turn the tides and where governments start to act in our favor and not against us.
Hear, hear. Thank you, Ange, and thank you all for your activism and the countless, you know, thousands of hours that you contribute towards achieving climate justice or taking us closer to climate justice. I'd like to give an opportunity to those in the crowd to ask questions if you have any. Please do pop your hand up, and I might get you to say your question and I can repeat it back so it's loud enough for folks viewing online. But hi. Yeah, good. Thank you so much. Yeah, so the question was, what are the Australian government arguing against this case? And I assume it's the Australian climate case. I'll pass over to Isabel.
So it's Uncle Pabai and Uncle Paul's job to prove that there is a duty, that there is harm, that there is a cause, that the Australian government is causing the harm. The Australian government's role is to say, no. It's not, we don't have a duty. It's not our fault. Climate change is happening. And also their argument is, well, this is getting a little bit too close to government high important policy work. Back off, you're a court, you're not an elected government. And, you know, some courts are receptive to that. You know, courts in Australia do tend to be very nervous about interfering or being perceived to be interfering with government processes, which at a certain level is deeply important and a positive thing. We want our democracy to have an independent judiciary, but we believe it's very clear on the law that this is a point of law, not a point of policy, to say, actually, this is some of Australia's oldest law, negligence law, and that old law says that actually, no, you do have a duty and you need to stop causing harm under that duty. It was very interesting on country, the government's approach. I would know we were all sort of taken aback by how honestly disrespectful the government tried to be and behaved the entire hearings. It really isn't legally necessary for the government to undermine the culture and personal experiences of people in the Torres Strait, but that was the attempt by the government. The government, their line of questioning was extremely disrespectful. It often said, you know, implied that people didn't have verifiable knowledge just because it wasn't written in a book somewhere in a British library. You know, one of the questions was, how do you know that the water temperature is warmer? And the person responded, well, because I put my hand in the water. I know the freaking temperature of the water. I mean, any surfer will be able to tell you, let alone somebody who has intergenerational deep connection with the place and spends every day in it. So that was pretty surprising. You know, I think that the government, our read is the government regrets how much they let through in Ange's case, that they were a little too eager to concede because they thought they could win on other points. But again, as I say, legally not necessary for the government to behave in this way, and something that we were very deeply disappointed by. We had a series of meetings and debriefs with the community, and that was, I think, an important part of the process, but people were pretty shocked by the behaviour. And so we really hope that the government decides to actually change its, at least tone a little bit in terms of its approach to these sorts of cases, working with First Nations people. It seems pretty inappropriate. Want to build on that for your case?
Yeah, it was really similar in my case. In my case, the government argued both that they didn't have a duty of care to young people and that they hadn't breached it. So on first instance, the federal court found that they did have a duty of care, and it was a landmark decision, and it meant that the years of climate policy that were to follow would have to be in line with the climate science. But then unfortunately, on appeal, the government then argued successfully that they both didn't have a duty of care and hadn't breached it. So it seems quite ridiculous to think about the fact that a government would spend taxpayer money arguing that they didn't have to care about the futures of young people, because really, what else is your job? But unfortunately, the court finds it very important to distinguish between a moral duty of care and a legal duty of care, when in my mind, as a young person, looking at the future that I'm about to inherit, they're really one and the same. I think that if my future is to be characterized by continuing natural disasters, and if I'm to watch my family in India currently be suffering through a heat wave and then a flood and then the ramifications of a cyclone that's just left India, then this duty of care should really extend to all young people in Australia. And the government should be implementing policy to ensure that the future that we're handed is not one that looks so bleak and really gives us no chance to feel hopeful. The government also, like Isabel said, really distinguished that the court should not be intruding into this area, and that the court's job is not to make policy, but really to rule on matters of policy when they're brought to the courts. Well, the reason that we took this matter of policy to the courts is because the governments aren't doing it themselves. If the government was to impose a duty of care on themselves, I would love that. Like, they would love that, I would love that, we'd all be happy. But they weren't doing that, hence we took it to the courts. So yeah, again, a disappointing line of argument. Unfortunately, they're one in my case, but I hope that Uncle Paul and Uncle Pabai's case is the one that turns the tides.
And just to explain, so the reason why we think that this case can win is that there's a different duty here. So in Angie's case, they were talking about a duty to young people, and in this case, we're talking about a duty to Torres Strait Islanders in regards of climate harm. So it's a narrower duty. It's a very specific group of people. And it is based in two things that is unique to the Torres Strait. It's the Torres Strait Treaty, as I've mentioned, and also native title law. So the reason that the Dutch case was able to win and establish a duty was because they have the European human rights framework. Unfortunately, we don't have that here, but we've got some other local stuff that's really important. And I think it's really interesting for Australians to know and think about the Torres Strait Treaty, especially at the moment with the voice debate going on. It's something that's, I think, unfortunately little known, but is a really interesting piece of work. If you'd like to look it up and have a little bit of a legal nerd out, as if you're a non-lawyer, I still recommend you giving it a go because it's very interesting.
Thank you, Isabel and Ange. And yeah, really, what greater responsibility should there be for a federal environment minister than to consider the duty of care to young people? So thank you for your activism. And I suppose, Kat, I'm interested to hear from you. One, what impact a strong advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice would have on cases such as Ange's? And secondly, what sort of level of ambition can we and should we expect from the Australian government as they prepare to hopefully make a submission to the International Court of Justice between now and October?
Thanks, Steph. The ICJ is so important to climate cases around the world. It's important to cementing the consensus on climate change. It's important to ensuring that countries are increasing their ambition under international agreements like the Paris Agreement, that they're doing their fair share to reduce emissions in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement to protect human rights. It's so important in terms of setting really clear obligations about what the government must do. And in our view, that means no fossil fuel subsidies. At the moment, we live in a country that is still greenlighting coal, oil and gas projects across the board. We live in a country that is still donating billions of dollars in the form of subsidies to the fossil fuel industry that is causing this harm. So for us, we want to see a really strong submission from the Australian government, a strong submission that sets a clear baseline about what they should be doing and what they expect other countries to do in order to tackle the climate crisis.
Thank you, Kat. Any other questions from the audience? Yeah, down the front here. Yeah, thank you for the question. So the question was, with the new human rights laws at the Queensland state level, will those new laws have any impacts on litigation going forward? And Isabel?
I think there actually is an action that's just launched. I'll let you speak to. Do you know about that one? There is an action that's just been launched in Queensland using the Queensland Human Rights Framework, and absolutely bang on. The state human rights frameworks will become increasingly important. They're not relevant in this case, unfortunately. Part of the trick with climate litigation, successful climate litigation, is targeting an actor who is big enough to have an impact on the broader climate space in terms of actual emissions. So the thing that's easy for a state government to do is say, like, look, we're too far down the line. Like, this is a global issue. There's a national response, and then we're kind of further down the line. But there definitely is relevance, particularly in terms of specific approvals. So where approvals are given within a state, that's where the human rights framework can really come in. Steph, I don't know if you know much about the recent action that's been the youth verdict action. Do you know? Okay, well, Google the youth verdict action, because I think that there is something that's just started in Queensland. Yeah. Anyone from youth verdict here? No? Any other questions? We don't have any coming in online yet, so if you are tuning in online, don't be shy. We're ready to take your questions, so please share them in the chat. But in the meantime, in the audience, I can see Sapaisa's hand up. Sapaisa, I'm going to get you to come up, actually, rather than read it out. Sapaisa is a senior campaigner with Greenpeace Australia Pacific and lives in Fiji. And I'm going to introduce him and also get him to ask his question. And then I might even ask Sapaisa a question while he's up here. So Sapaisa.
That's loaded. Thank you, Mbulavinak, everyone. My question is, I'm hearing all of this interesting work being done in terms of the land, our oceans and our fishing grounds and the land. How do we think this can be translated or linked to the Pacific, going into Vanuatu, Tuvalu, and then Fiji? I'm interested on how that will work. Yeah, we have 9 days on the ship, so I'll get more information. But how do we think this can be translated into the Pacific? So I'm hearing about the class action by Eng and our two matuas, or for us, matua is elders from Torres Strait. How will we make that happen to shape that? Thanks.
Uncle Pabai, would you like to speak first to the significance of travelling to the Pacific with your story?
Yes, I'll take you back to the we are the COP27 in Egypt, and me and Uncle Paul were present at the time, and we in partnership with the Pacific brothers and sisters, and that's opened our mind. According to the information that been delivered by the Pacific elders, the boys from the Pacific, that's reflected my mind back to how we live on the island as well. Pretty much similar to the Pacific brothers and sisters, and this journey we're just about to head off, and I really need to engage more about that. You hear that Uncle Paul mentioned that Anete Tong was visiting the communities, Bulgon Saibai, and he said that sorry about that. He said that the very first moment that he stepped out of the plane, that he mentioned that to me, that we are the same similar situation or what we live on, and that's give me the reflect back to my community what he said to me, and this journey will take me to his country. And it'll be we share the information across, and pretty much we live the same as the Pacific Nation brothers and sisters here.
Do you mind if I add a little bit to that? I think there is so much power in bringing together community leaders like Uncle Paul and Uncle Pabai with other litigants around the world that are doing something similar, because it is a huge lift to take a climate case. It is a huge lift to continually share your story about the impacts on your community. And so just to be able to sort of make space and share the lessons learned throughout these cases both in terms of litigation strategies at the lawyer level, but also in terms of what it's like to be a litigant and how to sort of navigate that space. I think there's a lot of beauty and power in that, and something that we're hoping will happen on this tour. And in response to Pessa's question, when we think about climate justice, there's sort of two sides of the coin, right? First of all, we need to see a stop to these extractive industries that are causing the climate crisis. We need to see a stop to fossil fuel projects that are fueling climate change. But then the other side of the coin is the understanding that actually a lot of damage has already been caused in the Pacific, in Australia. You know, we've seen the Lismore floods. It was only a couple of years ago that our cities were blanketed in thick black smog. Pregnant women couldn't leave the house at fear of what smoke inhalation from those black summer bushfires would do to unborn children. We lost 34 people and over 3 billion animals to the black summer bushfires that were fueled by the climate crisis, and thousands were left homeless. Like, that's an absolute example of the denial of human rights at the hands of climate change that is being fueled by the government. So on the first part of the coin, you've got stopping the extractive industries. But on the second sort of side of the coin, you've got looking at how, as far as possible, you can try to make reparation. And of course, there are things like life and culture that once lost, you can never truly repair. But there's also a place for this conversation around loss and damage. So around funding impacted communities that have lost out as a result of the climate crisis and forcing big polluters to pay for that. So we saw at the last COP in December, the establishment of a loss and damage finance facility. And that was incredibly exciting. That was something the Pacific has been pushing for over 30 years. So that's a funding facility that governments will contribute to that is designed to assist financially with the types of impacts that can't be mitigated against or adapted to that we're seeing from climate change. And that's incredibly important in terms of achieving some justice for Pacific communities and for climate impacted communities like Lismore and like those that are affected by the Black Summer bushfires. So that's another thing we hope we'll see in the Australian government's submissions, and we hope that the court will make a judgment on exactly what that funding facility should look like, what the obligations are on countries to contribute to that fund and do their share to ensure that we, as far as possible, are making reparations for the damage that has already been caused while we're working to stop that harm and that damage from occurring.
Yeah, thank you, Kat. And I think Isabel possibly has a few words to say, and then I'm going to go back to you, Sapesa.
Thank you. I just think just some more context. So Anote Tong, who the uncles have mentioned, is former president of Kiribati. He was president there for 10 years, global leader, statesman on climate action. And he came with us for a couple of weeks, and the communities in Boigu and Saibai signed a joint statement with Anote and the group that he represents called the Pacific Elders Voice, and that's a group of former presidents and prime ministers from the Pacific. The Murakal Sipa statement, All Together We Stand. And that is a shared statement of climate impacts. And it's really important because for two reasons. One, a statement of solidarity. People aren't alone in the Torres Strait. There are people who are also in the Pacific, really close by, who are dealing with the exact same issues. But also as a reminder to the Australian government, the Torres Strait is part of the Pacific and it is part of Australia. I was particularly interested in what's happening in the Pacific, thanks in part to China and thanks in part to AUKUS. The AUKUS sub deal happened, was announced a few days before Anote's visit to Saibai and Boigu, and Anote held a Zoom meeting on the AUKUS issue with the Defence Minister, Richard Marles, while we were on Saibai. And Anote said he was very clear to say to Richard Marles, oh, so I'm on Saibai and we're here, talking about the climate case and the impacts that people are seeing here in terms of climate change. And that's really, really important. And this trip is the next step in that piece. And that piece is really to actually build the leadership connections between the Pacific and the Torres Strait. The Torres Strait is a part of Australia, but it's also part of the Pacific. And if the Australian government is serious about looking after the Pacific, it has to also be serious about looking after the Torres Strait. It's about making this not just an environmental issue, but a foreign policy issue for Australia. And I'm so excited for Uncle Pabai and Uncle Paul to go and meet with activist students, leaders in Vanuatu to really drive that point home and build those relationships even more.
Thank you, Isabel. And so Sapesa, as a Pacifica man, I'd love to hear from you around what the Rainbow Warrior and the uncles and these climate litigants converging on the Pacific means to you, and obviously climate advocacy and action. Would you like to say a few words? I would love to hear from you.
I mentioned earlier that in terms of the Pacific, we are voyagers. So the ocean and the land is part of our lives. So when we see a person or an individual, you're looking at their ancestors, looking at their land, looking at the fishes of the sea. So as a Pacific Islander, someone from Fiji, the Greenpeace coming back to the Pacific is huge. It's the impact is, we can never say it in words. So when we were talking about the rainbow wires coming to the Pacific, we had to dig into our textbooks. Greenpeace and the rainbow wire is in our textbooks. So we share the story in terms of advocacy, in terms of looking at climate change, and we are at the front line of climate change and the climate crisis. So we see it every day. The women of our communities have to go further out into the sea and longer hours to get food on the table because of the impact of, we say, the bigger nations. And the campaign coming to the Pacific or sailing through the Pacific is testament that the work that we do will never end. It's huge and it's impactful. It's talking about voices and the work that we do every day. We have totems, we have plants, we have fishes, we have birds, and that's connecting to our everyday lives. So when a tree is cut down, my totem, the bird is a parrot. Yeah. So when we cut down trees, there goes my totem, cannot find a home to live in. So that's how impactful this will be. And sharing our stories wherever we see people, we see family, we see Vanua or land, and we see the community, and we see the world. So unless a culture of people or a family is looked after and their voices are shared, we will need to ask ourselves, what are we doing for everyone to ensure that the safety, the traditions, our culture, our songs, we don't write in the Pacific. We sing, we dance. At least I tell myself I'm a dancer, a good dancer. And we draw, and we hope that that remains protected and passed on to the next generation that comes after us. And we're very thankful for everyone up here and being given this opportunity to share these stories of, we will keep on marching and we will keep on working. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sepesa. And Sepesa will also be on board the Rainbow Warrior for the full duration of the tour, I believe. So you've heard some, I think, some incredible stories, testimony, reasons why we're all gathered here today and why these cases are being pushed forward by activists right across Australia and the Pacific. So what can you do? And I'd love to have a chat to both GRATA and Greenpeace and to give you an idea of what you can do after you leave today before we have some closing words. So perhaps I'll go to you first, Isabel. What should people take away from today?
Thank you. There are two important things that people can take away from today if they would like to stand in solidarity with Uncle Paul and Uncle Pabai. First is, this is a really bloody expensive court case. We have got to get experts, lawyers, our team, witnesses, the uncles all over the world. Vanuatu back, all the way up to the Torres Strait and back. Torres Strait from here is a 2-hour flight. You then get on another plane for 45 minutes to get to Uncle Pabai and Uncle Paul's home. So this is a really, really expensive case, and we would be very grateful for any contributions that you could make to the Australian climate case. So that's australianclimatecase.org.au. The other way that you can participate, I know donations are not always easy for everyone, especially at the moment. It's a pretty hard time for most people. The other way that is just as, if not more important, that you can contribute is by sharing your story of climate impacts. Now, the reason I know that that's important is Rebecca Huntley, who's a really renowned researcher, found that the best way to convince other Australians that climate change is happening and is bad, and to get them up the ladder of engagement in terms of their activism, is for them to be convinced that people like them are experiencing climate change in their lives now. So by sharing your story of climate change and climate impacts that you're witnessing from your own home, you will be sharing your story in solidarity with the uncles and their communities, but you'll also be saying to the Australian government in a dossier that will be presented to the Australian government, this is happening not just to people in the Torres Strait, but also to us. That's really, really important because we know with the new federal government that a lot of Australians think, yeah, the government's doing enough. They hear safeguard mechanism, they hear climate change a couple of times, they think that we're okay. We're really not okay. The targets are way off where the science says that they need to be. We know from the latest polling, 30% of Australians now think that the Australian government's doing enough. We really need people to share their stories so that we can keep engaging people and really showing them that actually climate change is not dealt with. This government's not going to cut the mustard unless some serious changes are taking place. And as you know, some of the most engaged people in the country on these issues for being here, I really think that it would be very, very valuable for you to share your stories and share the stories with others in your networks. Thanks so much. I'll let Greenpeace go from here.
Thank you. So I think there are some sheets going around now to perhaps share your experience of climate impacts, and there's the Australian Climate Case website. So do jump on there. And Katrina, we're obviously about to set sail right across the Pacific Islands, and people can tune in on Facebook or via their email to keep updates of that. But what specific action would you urge people to take today?
Absolutely. We would absolutely love it if you would jump on the Greenpeace website and sign the petition that we've put together calling on the Australian government to make a strong submission to the International Court of Justice. I've just arrived back from the Netherlands, where I got an opportunity to sit with some Australian ambassadors who are working in The Hague on the International Court of Justice. And at this point, disappointingly, they're saying that they don't know if Australia will make a submission, and if they do, what the substance of that submission could be. Now, if Australia truly wants to be seen as a good ally to the Pacific, if they want to maintain relevance in the region, they need to come to the party, and they need to start making big change when it comes to how they're greenlighting fossil fuel projects, how they're subsidizing them, how they're supporting the Loss and Damage Finance Fund. So we ask you to jump on our website, sign our petition calling on the Australian government to make that bold, persuasive submission to stand in solidarity with the Pacific. And of course, in addition to that, funding and donations are the lifeblood of Greenpeace. We are quite different to many other organizations in that we are fiercely independent. We do not accept a single dollar of funding from any corporation or government anywhere around the world, because we need to be independent in order to be in a position to speak truth to power and take the kind of cases that others may not be in a position to take simply because of the potential conflicts of interest or the pooling of funding. So in order to support many of those cases I've mentioned today, like Klimasinurinen and Bonaire, and to drive impact in the world and have these great Rainbow Warrior tours, we do, of course, really appreciate any funding that you can give. But we also understand that not everyone's in a position to make a donation. So if you can, please jump online and sign that petition. It'll mean the world to us. We will be presenting it to the Australian government. It will be a really persuasive avenue to help pressure them to create the change that we want to see at such a pivotal time. And if you're in a position to do more, we really, really appreciate that as well.
Thank you, Kat. And we'll send an email out to those of you who joined today with those links so you can click through. We're coming towards the end. So what I'm going to ask is for Uncle Pabai to give your closing remarks, really what the message that you want people to leave with today. Then I'm going to go to Ange to do the same. And then I'm going to ask you, Uncle Paul, to share a story with us that I believe will really ground us as we're leaving the Rainbow Warrior today. So I'll start with you, Uncle Pabai.
Thanks, Steph. Just on my closing remark on the statement that we delivered today, and I think it's a very powerful statement that everybody around the world, and every nation around the world, so we can get a lot of support and get on the journey and helping us, me and Uncle Paul, and around the world. That'll be really good to get us mostly supported, and I wanted to thank this from the bottom of my heart to and I'm honestly saying that your support will be really appreciated by me and Uncle Paul, in many other such of ways that we can get the support, by all means. That I'd like to thank you very much for all this. Thank you.
Thanks, Steph.
Yeah, like we've said today, this is really a historic voyage. It's people, campaigners from Greenpeace, along with Uncle Paul and Uncle Pabai, sailing across the ocean to meet Pacifica activists who are leading the charge against climate change. And it just goes to show that climate impacts are being felt so similarly by so many people in so many different places. And there are so many people obviously here who care. So I think that the number one message needs to be that our government is our government. They aren't the government for the fossil fuel corporations, for big polluters. They're accountable to us because we're the ones who elect them in. And even though fossil fuel corporations have big pockets, of course, and have all these lobbying networks, when we go to the polls, we all have the same vote, and that's a one vote. We're basically their employers. We're able to hold the government accountable in whatever way, shape, or form that may be. So like Isabel said, if you have the ability to donate or share your climate testimony, if you have the ability to share that petition, that's a way to stick it to our government and to show them that there are people here who are really demanding greater climate ambition. And there are so many of us who care. It's just now about translating that into a message that will be heard by the government to compel greater climate action.
Before I get into my closing remark, I might start off with, well, this morning we explained about two things, mud and a bushel. So Uncle Pabai was talking about explaining a bushel. So what it means to us in the Torres Strait and Pacific, and also a mud. So I start off with a bushel. So bushel for us in Torres Strait and Pacific is, see, once you blow the sail, that passes the message through, telling people, you know, it's a message passed by the bushel. And a mat, well, it can be woven in different threads and different colors. So colors on the mat can be represent different people of the nation, either white, black, red, whatever color you are. We are all on the same mat. Because it's all woven together, we have same blood. So my closing remark is, if you have one stick, you can't break it. If you have two, well, it can easily be broken. So if you have many sticks, what I mean is, we have many people, many race of people sitting around here. If you have many people and boys, we have many boys together, we'll have big boys to the government. So open our website and support us on our journey. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our panelists. And yeah, Mura Kamal Sipa, all together we stand. I think that has been the message that's come through loud and clear from today's discussion. I'd also like to say eso or thank you to the traditional owners and elders who have joined us here today. It's a great privilege to have you on board the Rainbow Warrior. Please, yeah. Sorry. This is the launching day of the journey, and so it's day one of the journey. Please join us for the remainder of this beautiful tour through the Pacific Islands, back to Australia, via our online channels, via the stories of, from Uncle Paul and Uncle Pabai. And yeah, please stand in solidarity with us because we've got a huge amount of work to do and we are stronger together. Thank you very much for joining us and have a lovely afternoon.